I remember those commercials.
Yeah, welcome to the back to the 90s.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. All right. If you first could tell me your name, where you're from, and a little bit about your childhood.
Sure. Do you want to know where I was from originally, or where I'm from now? Okay.
Where you're from originally.
My name is Joel Craig. Originally grew up just outside of Woodstock, New York. Grew up in a rural area, much like Germantown. Played in the woods a lot. Cowboys and Indians, and fished and rode bikes and all that fun stuff that we did back in the day. So I kind of grew up around in an area, as I said, small town. Everybody knew each other. And,
What brought you to Germantown?
After I got married, we were living in Hudson, and we were looking to raise a family, to build a house, and I was working in Dutchess County. I still do work in Poughkeepsie, commuting down there, so we needed to move a little bit closer. And at the time, real estate in Dutchess County was pretty expensive for people just starting out. So we came a little farther north, and we saw Germantown. We just fell in love with it because of the parks and the town. It just seemed like a great place to raise kids and to set down roots.
At what point in your life did you start to become interested in history and the Civil War?
I was interested in the Civil War very early on in elementary school. First time we studied it, I was interested in it, and I expressed that to my grandmother, and she said, "Oh, well, there's some stuff in the attic." And it turns out that I had ancestors who had fought in the Civil War. One in particular, my great-great-grandfather, had been in one of the more famous regiments of the war. And she had just enough to get my interest in him. And of course, my mom being a Southerner, I had him on both sides. So when you trace back that ancestry, haven't quite found that they were at the same battle at the same time, but it's still an interesting perspective.
What was it like to see those things, the documents or the artifacts that she had for the first time?
It was a real connection, and I've talked to other people who have become interested in Civil War, and a lot of times it's that family connection. There's this broad, sweeping event that really kind of tore apart and then reunited the United States, and to think that your family was part of that, it really kind of connects. Much like you're doing the oral histories here, you're connecting people back to Germantown, back to their roots. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of a light bulb. Oh, I had a stake in this.
Right. As far as the Civil War goes, what was the surrounding area, Germantown and that area? What was the atmosphere like in that day?
It was a very rural community. A lot of farms, a few little hamlet in Germantown, but for the most part, a lot of family farms, small family fruit farms, just a small, tight-knit rural community. There was still heavy Palatine presence here. It had only been a generation or two since they'd stopped speaking German, in the town. So it was still heavy, but they'd started to get an influx of people from the surrounding area living here. Again, just small, tight-knit community. In the years leading up to the Civil War, obviously, the issues had come up, and there had been political compromise after political compromise. So most of these communities, although they were well aware of the tensions, never thought that it would actually come to a civil war. They always just felt that there would always be another political solution. So when it did come in '61 with the firing of Fort Sumter, people were really shocked. And then, of course, the first reaction is this wave of patriotism. And really the only thing that in my lifetime that I've witnessed is the aftermath of 9/11, where you get this overwhelming patriotism and everybody wants to take part and everybody wants to do their part. And so I think that's pretty much what swept through the area in 1861 when war finally did break out. But people really at that point still did not know what they were in for. It was going to be a 90-day war. It was going to be this one big battle, and it would all be over and everybody be friends. And nobody really understood the breadth and the length and the sacrifice that would be taking place over the next 4 years.
Prior to the war actually happening, I know that you said that there were a lot of farms, and that's that's still the case. But was there any participation in slavery before that, and how did that?
We have to remember that, and people don't seem to remember this, because when you talk in terms of Civil War and slavery, everybody thinks it was in the South. But slavery in New York State was only abolished in the early 1800s. It had only been a couple generations since there had been slavery right here. And so there were still communities. There were communities in Germantown of African Americans who were the descendants of those slaves and servants, from the great Hudson Valley estates. It's something that only now people are starting to talk about, the fact that, there were slaves in New York. So there were those descendants, there were African American communities, and there were right here in Germantown, a small African American community.
When the war broke out and there was that patriotism that you were talking about, do we know kind of the volume of response as far as enlistment and all that kind of stuff from this town or from the area?
That's a good subject, because obviously everybody wanted to do their part, everybody wanted to volunteer, and the armies that were raised were volunteer armies. The United States Army was very small at that time, and most of it was stationed in the West. As we moved west, they needed that protection from the army. So there was really not a standing army. So you had to raise volunteers. And in a political sense, when this came and Lincoln issued his first call for 75,000 men, which was ridiculously too small, but again, everybody thought it was going to be over after one battle. Those quotas got filled up quite quickly in New York City and Albany. Because the bigger cities, they could raise the men like that overnight. They had more political pull, and you have to realize that volunteer regiments were officered often by men who had no military experience. Mm-hmm. So they had to have political connections. So New York City and Albany supplied the first group, and if people from, say, Columbia County did not travel to one of those places, they basically didn't get to enlist right in that first wave of patriotism. Some did. Most didn't, just because because of the dispersed population, and they didn't have the political connections to raise a regiment that quickly. As time went on, of course, and the reality of that it was going to be a long war and a lot more men were going to be needed, that's when most of the men from Columbia County, from Germantown, enlisted, and that would have been the summer of '62. After several Union defeats, Lincoln has to call for many more men to enlist, and when he does that, that becomes the opportunity locally for regiments to be formed. And even at that point, Columbia County, because the population really didn't have enough to be its own regiment, there was a kind of a hybrid Dutchess County, Columbia County regiment, which was raised by David Cowles, who was a young man from Hudson, very accomplished young man, in his mid-30s. He was probably the most eligible bachelor in Columbia County, had been the district attorney, he was a lawyer of some renown. So he had those political connections to become appointed as colonel of the regiment, and so he would go around to the communities. And the thing about the Civil War and these volunteer regiments were that they were raised locally. A company would be formed, say, from Germantown. It would be all men from Germantown, brothers, cousins, schoolmates, so they all knew each other well. It was a local company, and they would pull 10 of those together and make a regiment. And of course, the tragedy is when you get in one of these big battles, be Gettysburg or Bull Run or something, where one of these regiments really gets chewed up, is they're all from the same community, and the loss to the community is just staggering in some cases. So Cowles made the rounds of Dutchess and Columbia counties, and he would go to each town, and they'd have a rally, and he'd speak, and he'd get the men to sign up that way.
When that first wave went to war, the regiments, you went around and gathered people. It was already a farming town, so what were the ramifications for that move? Now these farms and the young men were no longer tending to them. So how did that change the dynamic of the town?
It was very difficult on these local farmers to have all of the young men, all the labor, basically leave. You know, this, in the case of the story of Charles Hover, which we can talk about, that was one of the issues with his father. His father did not want him to leave because he was the only son at that time. You know, he had several sisters, but he was the only son that could work the farm. And that was the case across the country, north and south, with these young men, and they were young, 18 to 25, say, most of them, leaving the farms and having to find that labor to keep it going. In some cases, the women had to take on bigger roles. In some cases, the immigrant force, you know, there were still a lot of, in that day, Irish, and there had been Germans, you know, they would have to hire labor. But it was definitely an impact on the local economy and local families. These young men had gone off the war, and even later, when many of them didn't come back, or they came back and they were incapacitated and couldn't work on the farms.
With the start of the war and the I guess the slave population in the South heading north to freedom, was Germantown or the surrounding area?
When actually in the years prior to the war, when you had the Underground Railroad, there were a lot of passing through the area. It's not so much as everybody had secret compartments or anything like that in their houses, but they would get them, people who were sympathetic to the cause. If they get to New York City, they would put them on steamers, take them up the river. It was the fastest way to get them, move them through New York and get them to Canada, where they really had safe haven. But once the actual fighting happened, it kind of closed the door, other than when the Union Army moved into an area. And then these slaves would kind of glom onto the Union Army and follow them for safety. So that initially, you know, in the first years of the war, before they could enlist or before they could do anything with them, if they could get to the Union Army, they would do so, and then they would save, which sometimes caused problems for the Army because they now had to feed all these people and care for them and fight a war at the same time.
So going back to Charles Hover, can you tell us a little bit about?
Sure. He was one of those young men raised on a family farm. He was, as I said, he was the only son in the family at that time. He was very enthusiastic when war broke out. He wanted to enlist right away. He was only 17 and his father would not consent to that. You know, as some teenagers and their fathers, you know, have their struggles, he and his father, you know, had several conversations, shall we say, over the dinner table about him enlisting, and his father was not for that at all. In fact, he enlisted Charles' grandmother to kind of bribe him that she would, you know, give him a buggy and a horse if he would, you know, just stay on the farm and work the farm. His father was not particularly enamored with, you know, the patriotism. He was, you know, he felt that Lincoln and the Republicans had started this war, and he did not want his son to take part in it. He wanted him to stay home. When Cowles had, Colonel Cowles came through Germantown and had a rally, Charles was one of those who went and enlisted against his father's wishes. And Charles' sisters went to the father and said, guess what Charlie did? Which, you know, created another heated argument. When Charlie turned 18 and he was old enough to go, he basically ran away. He was out in the fields working. He came in for lunch, and while he was there, he went into his room, tossed his stuff out the window, went back outside, picked up his stuff, and walked to Hudson to enlist. So, he was a very determined young man.
So from there, he enlisted, and what was do you know where he went from there, kind of what his story was during the war?
Sure. He enlisted in 128th New York, which was a regiment raised primarily in Dutchess and Columbia counties. They initially trained at what was at the time the Columbia County Fairgrounds, which is kind of Fairview Avenue in Hudson area. They trained there, and then they were put on ships, taken down to Baltimore for additional training. This was the summer of 1862. And then towards the fall, they were ordered out. Now they thought they were going to go to Virginia. Obviously that was the big theater at the time, and most of the New York regiments had been going to Virginia. As it turns out, they were sent to Louisiana. And along the way, many of these rural farm boys had never been exposed to some of the diseases, some of the childhood diseases, even like chickenpox and measles and so forth. And they had an epidemic on the ship, and a number of them died on the way there. And then once they got down to Louisiana, they immediately put the whole regiment into quarantine because they were all so sick. So it was quite a while before they actually got to the front, and when they did, they were a very long way from home. You can imagine most of these boys had never been farther than 100 miles. Some of them had probably never been out of Columbia County. And now they find themselves in late summer and early fall in Louisiana. So it was quite a shock to them. The interesting thing is a lot of these farm boys, when they're out, it's frustrating sometimes when you're reading their letters or their diaries, or they're writing home, and they're farmers, so now they're in the South and they're seeing a whole different way of agriculture. And they're writing about soil conditions and weather and things like that a farmer, would interest a farmer. And you're like, but tell me about the battle. Tell me about, But they were still farmers still, and they would write about the farms that they saw in the South and the way that the agriculture and the crops that they were growing down there.
Did he? How did he finish out the war? Was he?
Well, the first major battle was Port Hudson, and you hear a lot about the siege of Vicksburg. But at the same time, on the other end of Mississippi, they were besieging a town called Port Hudson, and it was a true siege. And that was the regiment's first big battle. And they were ordered to assault fortifications across an appropriate named field owned by a farmer named Slaughter, so it was known as Slaughter's Field. The 128th attacked. The fortifications were really impregnable. It was, it was pretty much a suicide attack. They suffered heavy casualties, and Colonel Cowles was killed mortally wounded in the first major battle of the regiment. Port Hudson did eventually fall. They did serve in the Louisiana area throughout '62 and 1863. They were involved in the Red River campaign, which was another fiasco. And they saw pretty hard service down there in the Western Theater. In 1864, General Grant takes over all of the armies. He comes to Washington to lead the armies in the East against General Lee. And he realizes that he does not have enough men to accomplish the task, everything that he needs to do. He's waging a new kind of warfare. He's not just fighting Lee, but he orders Sherman to begin his march across Georgia, and he orders Phil Sheridan basically to clean out the Shenandoah Valley. The Shenandoah Valley was a big source of food and supplies for the Confederate Army. It was also their major invasion route. They had twice before, there had been major invasions, which ended with the Battle of Antietam and the Battle of Gettysburg. They had come through the Shenandoah Valley. And then in that July, General Early had led a group right to the gates of Washington, basically. And so Grant said he was going to, he said to Sheridan, let's shut him down. He said basically, that I don't want a crow to be able to find any food in that valley. And Sheridan did just that. He began a campaign with some of these troops that had come from Louisiana were added to his command, including the 128th. And so now they were in the Eastern Theater. They were in Virginia. And he began a campaign in late '64 where he basically burned and took anything of any use in the Shenandoah Valley. And they drove the Confederates in front of them. And in October of '64, they were just south of Winchester, Virginia, and had pretty much cleared the valley and had no thought that the Confederates would be able to mount a counterattack. Sheridan had gone to Washington to confer with Grant and Lincoln, and in that October Charlie Hover was with the 128th, was ordered out one night, on guard detail, and they moved about a mile out from the main Union camp. And unbeknownst to them, the Confederates had been watching from the mountains and had been planning a counterattack. They had received reinforcements and they were able to get up. If you've been in the Shenandoah in the early morning, the fog is like pea soup, you can't see anything. And so they just swept over the Union Army, through that. Before they even knew what hit them, they were in their camps and driving through. The 128th, this group that Charlie was with, about 100 men from the 128th, were again about a mile out from camp. Suddenly they hear firing and all this going on. They have no idea, they still can't see anything, and it seems to be coming from behind them. And then they see troops coming up from behind them. They assume they're reinforcements. They turn around and large Confederate forces surrounded them, and they have to surrender. And that becomes a long journey for Charles Hover into the prisoner of war, as a prisoner of war, into the southern POW camps, which he writes about quite a bit in his memoirs.
Did he ever make it home?
He did make it home. He was sent through Richmond down to Salisbury, North Carolina, and it was very, very difficult because basically by the time they got there, the South could barely keep their own troops in the field, could barely feed and supply them, so they had nothing for prisoners of war. And Grant's campaigns had been very bloody, and they had captured a lot of men that the South had in '64. They had a lot of prisoners of war, and really couldn't care for them. By the time he got to Salisbury, it was basically a stockade, much like Andersonville, where they had built a wooden wall around the prison, and then inside, if you didn't have a tent, which most of them didn't, they would have been taken from them by the Confederates. You dug a hole in the ground and you lived, like a gopher basically in the ground. And that's what he found when he got there. Was basically there was no shelter, very little food. Winter was coming on, disease was rampant, and he describes in great detail his travails as a prisoner of war. He did survive, and he credits it with just basically that he decided that he would not die there. And he says that several of his compatriots, his comrades, some of them from Germantown, basically they just despaired, they just gave up and just died. So they're trying to catch rats, stray dogs, anything they can to survive those months, those winter months, and not freeze to death. It was a very cold winter, even in the deep South that year. But he does survive, and he comes back a shell of himself. He was not a big man to begin with, but just a shell, just kind of wrecked physically. But he was tough, because eventually he becomes the last surviving Civil War veteran from the town of Germantown. Lives well into the 1900s.
Wow. There was another kind of unique story about the Civil War who enlisted. Can you tell me about a bit about?
Sure.
him?
Charles Robinson was from Germantown. He was probably part of that little African American community that had been descendants from slaves or servants. With the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the Union Army was allowed to raise regiments of African American troops, and he enlisted in one of those regiments and did go off, did serve. He became a sergeant, actually, non-commissioned officer. From what I can tell, he was present at the siege of Petersburg. He was probably not, by the time he got there, he was not involved in the Battle of the Crater, which was, basically a massacre for African American troops. But he was present there, and he was present at the assault on Fort Fisher near Wilmington, North Carolina. Apparently was, he was a big man, athletic, well built. And he was respected in the Germantown community. He had a certain amount of stature, even being an African American in the 1860s. Germantown contributed even then. He is in Reformed Church Cemetery in the back. You can see his military headstone.
Did he make it home after the war?
He did make it home, yes, he did survive. He suffered some disease along the way, but he did make it back, and he worked and lived in Germantown until his death many years later.
The years after the war ended, I know that there wasn't any fighting up here. We didn't see battle up here, but what changed in the town after that war had concluded?
Obviously, they did lose. There were men killed and there were men wounded from Germantown, and that's always very difficult. It always impacts a small community. But of those who did come back, including Charles Hover, I think they took on a leadership role. You know, they had seen the wider world, they had survived things that nobody else in this town had survived, and people looked to them, you know, for leadership. Sure, certainly, Hover, you know, he became the postmaster. He eventually became town supervisor. He founded the Germantown Telephone Company. He was one of the founding members of the fire department. He had a very active political and social life, you know, in his later years, and certainly had a big impact on the town. And I think that was the case with a lot of these veterans, you know, those who could. They had a certain amount of stature when they came back to their salt communities.
What was I going to say? Sarah, what was I going to say?
I don't know. Do you have a sense of what the village of Germantown looked like in terms of its, either before or after the war, in terms of the shops that were?
If you look at the postcards around the turn of the century, and maybe you can help, the name is like gone, the photographer from Germantown.
Oh, Gibson, Howard Gibson.
No, the one that took the postcard, early postcards, Van.
Not Mass. What? Not Van Tassel?
Not Van Tassel, no.
No, I only know Howard Gibson, but.
If you look at those old postcards, you'll see. In the sad thing was he was also a Civil War veteran, but he'd taken some photos of Germantown. You know, you could the iconic ones like Central House and the one, you know, as you're looking down Main Street that he had taken. They're very much what the town looked like back then. It was a small rural town with muddy roads and little shops. You know, and then you know, as with commerce, they had built quite a complex of storage buildings down by the river, and the ships would come in. And you know, some of the men worked in those, including Charles Robinson, worked in those cold storage buildings that were down by the river. You know, packing fruit and shipping and so forth. But in terms of change. There wasn't a whole lot of change. It really wasn't until you get into the 20th century and you start to see, you know, change in Germantown. A lot of things have stayed the same for a very long time.
The building that we're in, the parsonage, during the Civil War, was this, I mean, was there any significance to this building? Was it used for anything? I know, again, there was no battle up here, but
not that I know of. It was a residence at that point. It had passed out of being a parsonage. They had rebuilt the churches in different places of the town. Interestingly enough, and talking with Alvin Sheffer, you know, he believed that African Americans lived for a time in this building, in this house, and that they were probably related to Charles Robinson, if not his family especially lived in this home. So this area even was it was a lower income area at the time. And like as I said, the house had passed out from the church and then had a succession of people living here or renting it. So.
In your experience, I know being that you're a lover of history, how has, in your lifetime, how has Germantown changed?
I think there has been more of an urban influx. When I first moved here, it was still a very small town and everybody was still very connected, you know, and as people age and people move out and pass away, and then certainly the discovery of the beautiful Hudson Valley in this area, you know, people have moved in. I think for the most part, those people still love the history of Germantown, and you know, that's the great thing about it. They still have a respect for that history, but it's much more diverse than it was, you know, when I moved to the town, I think.
And on the other hand, I mean, what's the constant in Germantown? What's stayed the same? How, you know?
Yeah, I think that desire for community, for small town, you know, to connect to this place, it was certainly for me. I wanted to contribute, and that's how I got involved in the town, you know, almost from the time I moved here, doing something. There's a little bit of timelessness, you know, just that even though it is the 21st century, there's still a little bit of, you can still see things like this that harken back almost 300 years. And you know that people have been here and it's still not totally changed. It hasn't been paved over and it hasn't been, you know, there's still maintains that character to a certain extent.
For you personally, what does Germantown mean to you? What does it represent for you?
It represents, I think, a little piece of Americana. You know, the ideal, the house with the white picket fence kind of community. You know, that we can hang out to, and that people, you know, in time of need can help each other out and so forth. I really think that's kind of what it means to me. A little bit of the Norman Rockwell, you know.
Yeah. What would you like to pass on to the future generations? Knowledge or you know, ideals? What would you hope to?
I would just like, you know, people to look back at their history, either their own family history or the history of the community they live in, and think of the sacrifices that were made. You know, it's 150 years since the Civil War. But I think a lot of people don't really think of what that did. It united us as a country. It set millions of people free. And it was a big deal. Even here, as you say, there was no battles, but certainly, you know, we walk through any of the cemeteries and you see those bronze GAR stars, or you look through the muster rolls and you see the guys that didn't come out. It was a big deal at the time. And so I would just say, you know, you don't have to be a lover of history, you don't have to be into the Civil War particularly, but just a sense of perhaps your own history and the history of the nation and certainly the area that, you know, what has gone before.
So
No.
perfect.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice note to end on.
Yeah. Thank you very much for
My
sitting and
pleasure.
chatting with us.
My
It was
pleasure.
awesome to hear all that information.
And I hope you can make it, mold it into something usable.
Yeah, we will.
Fort Myers.
Fort Myers.
Fort Myers. We'll edit that in post.
But it was banned.
Here, I'll take that for you.
No,
No,
nothing.
there's nothing in there with Van.
Van
Yeah, that's.
Court Myers.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
that's who I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
And you have a picture of them in uniform that I gave.
Mom, did you have those any copies of those postcards or anything?
That would be cool.
That would be great because we would take some photos of that.
Should have, I don't know if you got a Civil War volume, you got the picture.
I think we do, and you know, this building.
Yeah, there might be some things to it.
Yeah, it's still good. It's still, yeah, it's still updated.
Exactly. Yeah, I do. I have a Civil War file. You got it from us, right?
Yes, I got most of the stuff, other than that picture of Fort Myers, which I gave you. I'm not sure if things are properly identified. I don't know.
Right.
Pretty sure we do. But if not, I've got a digital.
Yeah,
I'm sleepy.
that's gonna be exhausting. I'm sure for him too. Like, that's a lot of history to get, especially in that time.
Yeah.
It's in with his family, the whole
When you're ready.
What's that?
I just, if I'm in your age.
Oh, no.